It was a silent night in Bethany, where the snow was falling leisurely, covering the streets in a pure white blanket. In the houses, lights flashed red and gold, and Christmas carols escaped from the windows. But inside Samuel's house, the silence was absolute. He was sitting in his old armchair, staring at the unlit fireplace, lost in thought. Before continuing, be sure to subscribe to the channel to receive more incredible stories from the chosen ones. Samuel was an ordinary man, stuck in a routine that was slowly consuming him. At 47, he had worked in the same office for decades, filling in reports and dealing with emails that never seemed to end. He had a simple house, a stable life, but an emptiness was growing inside him. As Christmas approached, that emptiness seemed greater, as if the joy around him only highlighted what was missing in his heart. Then, on that quiet night, something happened. A sound. A whisper. It wasn't something that came from outside, but from within. "It's time, Samuel. It's time to leave." He stood up abruptly, his heart racing. He looked around, but he was alone. The sound was clear but incomprehensible. What did it mean to leave? Where to? Why? Over the next few days, Samuel couldn't forget that moment. He tried to ignore it, attributing it to exhaustion or stress. But the feeling persisted. It was as if something inside him was waking up, calling him on a journey he didn't yet understand. The emptiness Samuel felt became more evident. Before, he had been able to mask it with work or distractions, but now it was impossible to ignore. Mornings were marked by a feeling of dissatisfaction that followed him into the night. He would sit at his desk at work and stare at the computer screen, wondering, is this it? Is this what I was made for? Even in his leisure time, the feeling persisted. He watched movies, read books, but nothing seemed to fill that hole in his soul. There was an inexplicable longing for something more, something greater. But what? He didn't know. Samuel began to realize that this restlessness wasn't new. It had been there for years, but he had ignored it, burying it under the responsibilities of everyday life. Now, however, it was impossible to avoid. It was as if every aspect of his life was begging for change. While walking through the city one Saturday afternoon, Samuel passed a narrow alley and noticed a piece of paper lying on the sidewalk. He almost ignored it, but something made him stop and pick it up. It was a simple flyer, inviting volunteers to help out at a local homeless shelter over Christmas. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket, without thinking much about it at the time. That same week, he received a call from an old friend. They hadn't spoken for years, but the friend mentioned that he was organizing an event to raise funds for needy children. "Samuel, I thought you might want to help," he said casually. The phrase echoed in Samuel's mind. Why would he think that? Why would he invite him after all this time? These small events began to accumulate. It was as if the universe was lining everything up to point Samuel in a new direction. He began to realize that these flukes were not so accidental. Samuel began to remember other times in his life when he had felt this kind of push. There was the time in his youth when a teacher had told him that he had the power to change lives, but he never took it seriously. Then there was the time when he almost abandoned his career to follow a dream, but fear stopped him. Now those signs were clearer than ever. He began to pay attention to everything around him. Strangers smiling at him in the street, messages of hope that seemed to be everywhere, on signs, in conversations he overheard at random, even in snippets of music playing on the radio. But what struck him most was the growing feeling that he needed to take action. It was as if every cell in his body was saying, "Don't wait any longer. It's time to take the first step." When Samuel finally decided to answer the call, he knew it would require sacrifices. He would have to give up the job that, although monotonous, offered stability. He would have to face the judgment of friends and family who probably wouldn't understand his decision. Fear began to take hold. What if he failed? What if this call was just a figment of his imagination? He remembered the words of a work colleague. "You have a good life. Don't ruin it looking for something that might not even exist." But Samuel knew deep down that staying where he was would be the real failure. He began to prepare his departure, little by little, without telling anyone. It was a painful process, but also liberating. When Samuel started volunteering at the shelter, he found a new world. There, he met people who faced immeasurable challenges, but who still had hope. There were children who laughed, even though they had almost nothing. There were elderly people who shared their life stories with wisdom and gratitude. One evening, while he was helping to serve a meal, a young woman called Clara told him something that touched him deeply. Sometimes we lose everything in order to understand what really matters. God always has a plan, even when we can't see it. These words echoed in Samuel's mind. He began to realize that the call he had felt was not only to help others, it was also to heal himself. While doing voluntary work, Samuel began to reflect on his own life. He realized how he had spent years chasing things that didn't matter: status, security, approval. He also began to understand that his restlessness was a gift. It was God telling him that there was something more for him. Working at the shelter brought Samuel a wave of gratification, but also moments of doubt. There were nights when he wondered if he had made the right choice. Leaving a stable job and a predictable life to serve meals and organize clothes for people he barely knew sometimes seemed like a mistake. One night, as he walked home in the pale moonlight, he saw a group of children playing in a snow-covered park. Their laughter echoed in the frosty air, and Samuel stopped for a moment to watch. He realized that these children, who probably came from struggling families, were finding joy in the simplest things. It was a reminder that true happiness didn't come from material comfort, but from a heart full of purpose. When he got home, Samuel opened an old notebook he had found in the attic a few days earlier. There, he had recorded dreams and thoughts from his youth. One of them said, "I want to do something that changes the world, even if it's just a little bit." He closed the notebook and smiled. Finally, he felt he was returning to that forgotten purpose. Not everyone was happy with Samuel's decision. His former work colleagues thought he was being reckless. Some friends hinted that he was going through a midlife crisis. Even his sister, with whom he had always had a close bond, expressed concern. "Samuel, you're throwing your life away," she said during a phone call. "You have a stable career, something many people want. Why abandon that for something so uncertain?" These words hurt him deeply. He knew that his sister spoke out of love, but he also knew that she didn't understand what he was going through. Responding to God's call, he realized, didn't always make sense to others. It was something deeply personal. He decided not to argue. Instead, he prayed silently that night, asking for the strength to move on. He felt an unexpected peace in his heart, as if God was saying, "Keep going. I'm with you." One particularly cold morning, while helping to organize a special Christmas event at the shelter, Samuel was tasked with decorating a small tree. As he was hanging the lights and ornaments, a boy of about 8 approached him. "Do you believe in miracles?" asked the boy, holding a golden star in his hand. Samuel was surprised by the question, but answered honestly, "I think so. And you?" The boy smiled and said, "My mother says that when we help people, God gives us a little piece of his light. I think that's a miracle." Samuel felt tears well up in his eyes. In that instant, something clicked. He realized that, in responding to God's call, he wasn't just helping others. He was being transformed. Every little act of kindness was like turning on a light in his own soul. Shortly after the Christmas event, one of the volunteers recommended that Samuel watch the series The Chosen. He was reluctant at first, thinking it was just another religious production. But as he watched the first episode, he was deeply impacted. He saw reflections of his own journey in the characters' stories. Peter, struggling with doubt. Mary Magdalene, finding redemption. Matthew, abandoning everything to follow something greater. Each episode seemed to speak directly to him, as if God was using those stories to reaffirm his purpose. Samuel began watching the episodes every night, using them as devotionals. He wrote down reflections in his notebook and shared his discoveries with other volunteers. He realized that being one of God's chosen ones was not just a title, but a responsibility to live a life of love, faith, and purpose. At the end of his first day at the shelter, Samuel felt something he had never felt before: fullness. He knew he would still face challenges, but now he saw his life in a new light. Every day was an opportunity to serve, learn, and grow. Samuel also began to realize how God was using his past experiences to shape him. His patience, cultivated in years of corporate work, was now helping him to listen carefully to people's stories. His ability to organize processes was being used to improve the logistics of the shelter. He finally understood that God's call wasn't just to leave him alone. It was to align him with the divine plan, to set him on a path that would make him a light for others. The following Christmas, Samuel found himself surrounded by people in the shelter, now no longer as a novice, but as a leader. He shared a message that he had been preparing for weeks. God calls us in ways we don't always understand. Sometimes it's a whisper, sometimes it's a storm. But if we listen and follow, He will take us to places we never imagined. Remember, each of us is chosen for something extraordinary. The greatest gift we can give the world is to answer the call and trust that He is with us, always. As Samuel spoke, he looked around and saw smiles and tears. He knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Christmas Eve at the shelter was a spectacle of simplicity and love. Voices mingled in song, and the lights on the Christmas tree glowed softly, reflecting on the faces of everyone there. Between hugs and smiles, something deeper was happening. Hearts were being transformed. In that atmosphere of unity, renewal, and faith, everyone seemed to know that something special was happening. After dinner, a reverent silence took over the room. It was time to share words of reflection, and Samuel, who until then had been a discreet volunteer, felt called to speak. He stood up, holding a small candle he had lit minutes before, and looked around. Every face there was a living testimony to God's grace and strength. Friends, I want to share something I've been learning on this journey. God calls us in ways we don't always understand. Sometimes it's a whisper. Sometimes it's a strong push. But His call is always clear when we open our hearts to listen. He doesn't choose the perfect. He chooses the willing. And if we are here today, it is because we have been chosen for something greater. The flame of the candle Samuel held seemed to symbolize what he felt, a small light that had been growing in his heart ever since he had decided to respond to God's call. When God calls us, He doesn't just show us a new path. He transforms us so that we can light the paths of others. I'm sure that, like me, many of you have felt, at some point, that emptiness, that restlessness that makes you ask, is this all there is? Is this what I was made for? Today, I know that that emptiness was not the end, but the beginning of something extraordinary. Samuel placed the candle in the center of the table and picked up a book from beside it. Something that has been fundamental for me is the 40-day devotional, The Chosen. It has helped me to reflect on how we are called and how God shapes us throughout our journeys. Each day is an opportunity to renew our faith, to reconnect with God and with who we really are. It's a transformative experience that I encourage all of you to try. Samuel's eyes filled with emotion as he looked at the people around him. No matter where you are in life or what you have faced, God is calling you. You may not see the full path now, but He is asking you to trust, to take the first step. And I promise that in doing so, you will discover something incredible. The peace that comes from being aligned with God's plan for your life. He paused, letting his words echo in everyone's mind. Tonight, I would like you all to reflect on the call that God is making on your life. Write in the comments below, what is on your heart? It could be a dream, a prayer, something you're searching for. Let's create a space to support each other, to grow together as a community of faith. He took a deep breath, feeling the presence of something greater there with them. Samuel smiled as the people around him began to share their own stories and reflections. It was more than Christmas. It was a new beginning. The light that had been lit that night wasn't just symbolic. It was real, alive, and present in the hearts of everyone there. Just as Samuel had found his purpose, everyone there realized that by listening and responding to God's call, they were participating in something much bigger than themselves, a journey of faith, love, and transformation. And that night, amid the soft glow of the candle and the warmth of togetherness, they knew that they were not alone. They were chosen. And that changed everything. My name is George, and I am a spiritual leader who is with you on this journey. Today, I ask you to reflect on what God is saying to your heart. Perhaps He is calling you to something new, to a change, to a greater purpose. I want you to share that. Write in the comments below what God has been speaking to you, or what you want to hand over to Him. It could be a prayer, a dream, a thank you, or even a struggle you're facing. Let's create a space of faith where we can support each other as God's chosen ones.